We're very, very grateful to Paula Clifford for coming for this whole weekend. I know lots of people have enjoyed already interacting with Paula during the weekend, and especially for taking what is almost the toughest spot on, at the end of a conference, which is the final session, and the one, as I said, after Sunday lunch. But we know that Paula's up to this. She's currently leading Christian Aid strategy on climate change. She's head of church communications for Christian Aid and speaks at a lot of conferences and travels enormously widely. I know she just came back from South America only a few days before the beginning of this conference, so we're very, very grateful to her for coming and giving this time. And, a lot of that travel has involved work with AIDS and so forth, but now she's shifted more into this whole issue of climate change. So over to Paula. Thank you very much.
And finally, by way of introduction, I should make it absolutely clear that I'm not a scientist. And I'm actually very grateful to the previous speakers at this conference for presenting their ideas with such clarity that even I shall leave Cambridge much better informed than when I came, so thank you for that. So, you may well have been wondering what someone who works for an overseas development organisation is doing here at a conference on science and religion. The purpose of Christian Aid, like other organisations, is to tackle poverty. We're not an evangelistic organisation. We don't set out to spread the gospel in the countries where we work. Indeed, we try to support people of all faiths and people of no faith. And where appropriate, we work through mosques, temples, Buddhist temples, as readily as we do through Christian churches. Nor are we much engaged with science, except insofar as some of our advocacy and policy work demands a certain knowledge of things like biotechnology or plant varieties, because these are areas where the scientific progress of developed countries directly impacts poorer countries. But we are the official agency of the Christian churches in the UK and Ireland. We're supported by 40 different denominations. I had no idea till I went to Christian Aid that there were 40 different Christian denominations in this country, but there are. And we work alongside our sister agency, CAFOD, that is the agency of the Roman Catholic Church. And as such, as the agency of the churches, our work to alleviate poverty has to be underpinned by clear theological principles. So although some of the partner organisations through whom we work in around 50 different countries may have a very different religious ethos from ours, Christian Aid's engagement with them and with the poor people with whom they work has to be firmly rooted in the Christian gospel. And part of my job as head of communications for Christian Aid is to help formulate the theological principles on which our work is based. And that's not as straightforward as it may sound. And the main question I'd like to address this afternoon, not quite the title actually, is to ask what theology, what theoretical principles are we talking about when, as an organisation, we're working in a very practical way with people who may be the victims of war or genocide, victims of natural disaster, people dying of AIDS, people whose lives have been ruined by such things as unfair trade rules or a changing climate. How are we to formulate such theological principles and apply them? So this talk, if you like, is going to be about doing theology. And the first point I'd like to make is that theology, at least in the Protestant tradition, is fluid and changing. Many people prefer to talk about theologies in the plural to emphasise the many different mini-systems that have emerged or are still emerging within Christian theology. So you have black theology, feminist theology, and so on. Theology is changing. To give you a very simple example, I've just come back a few days ago from the Central American state of El Salvador. El Salvador, where most famously Archbishop Oscar Romero was murdered 26 years ago, and where a number of Jesuit priests were killed in the civil war that followed that. Now, with Romero's death, the Christian church, or much of the Christian church, had to rewrite and expand its definition of martyrdom. Because Romero wasn't killed because he was a Christian, which is the traditional age-old definition of being a martyr. Romero was killed because he proclaimed that the Christian church in El Salvador was a church for the poor. It was his defense of the poor people of El Salvador, who make up around 80% of the population, in the face of extreme oppression from the ruling right-wing rich, that led to his martyrdom. And so the meaning of martyrdom has expanded naturally to include, to accommodate this new reality facing the Christian church. It includes now being killed for putting the principles of your faith into action, beyond simply being a member of that faith. Now, self-evidently, the world is constantly changing. Science is evolving, and theology needs to change, not least to accommodate the new realities that science puts before us. And in the last few years in my work at Christian Aid, as Dennis has said, I've been working with these new scientific and theological realities on two fronts. Climate change, most recently, and before that, the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And I want to include a few comments on HIV as well here, because for a theologian, it seems to me that there are several similarities between the two issues, between the HIV pandemic and climate change. Firstly, with both HIV and climate change, science has presented us with a situation for which there's no parallel in the Bible. Certainly, the Bible talks about sickness and suffering, but HIV is more than sickness. The Bible talks about the natural world. We've heard a lot about this, and I'll come back to it later. But climate change is very much more than a concern for the natural world. So when, in the last couple of decades, churches attempted to formulate a Christian theological approach to HIV, they naturally, instinctively looked typically for the nearest biblical equivalent, and they tried to construct their theology on the basis of that. And the first attempt, as you may remember, was disastrous. In the early 1980s, most reported cases of HIV/AIDS were among gay men and sex workers, activities of which the Christian church disapproved. And so HIV was presented, particularly in the United States, but also to some degree in Europe, as God's punishment for sin. The biblical parallel with HIV that was cited most frequently were the plagues in Exodus, and preachers urged repentance rather than compassion. All this changed, particularly, of course, in sub-Saharan Africa, when churches and church leaders began to see that their own people were being affected by HIV. People who weren't gay, people who weren't sex workers, people who were not only in heterosexual relationships, but wives who'd always been faithful to their husbands, children who'd contracted the virus from their mothers, emotively and inaccurately referred to as innocent victims. And so the church began to preach compassion instead of repentance, and it had to look for a new biblical model, either in the healing miracles of Jesus, although there is no cure for HIV and no accepted genuine healing of the condition, or they looked to the parables. And I have to say that the only acceptable parallel I can find is in the parable of the Good Samaritan, where an anonymous victim of crime is generously and compassionately cared for with no questions asked. So there is naturally a search for biblical parallels in these areas where there is no exact biblical equivalent of our present day problem. And the second similarity between HIV and climate change is that in both cases it's the poorest people who are disproportionately affected, and Bob touched on that this morning. And this is where I think we need to move beyond the search for immediate biblical parallels in order to take account of this new dimension, the type of person who is being affected by climate change and HIV. In the case of HIV/AIDS, it's poverty rather than perceived immorality that's the main driver of the infection across the world. a mother in Zambia or Uganda or the Democratic Republic of Congo who has no means of feeding her children will turn to sex work rather than let them die. A girl whose parents can't afford secondary school fees will sleep with her teacher in order to safeguard her access to education. Men who are driven from their communities by lack of work, which may be down to natural disasters or loss of livelihoods, they become vulnerable once they're away from their normal, safe environment. It's the poorest people who are most at risk in the case of HIV. There are many more examples of that type I could give you. And so when a couple of years ago I was faced with the problem of formulating a theology that took adequate account of HIV, I didn't spend too much time looking for biblical parallels, or public parallels, if you like, in Bible stories. I found that instead I needed to return to basic principles, and I looked to a covenantal theology, such as that presented by Karl Barth, that looked at the relationships between God and his people, and therefore by extension between those people themselves. And this seemed to me a reasonable model in which to address the problem of HIV. But HIV also demanded a theology that acknowledged suffering. And here for me, the best model is Jürgen Moltmann. I don't know whether you're familiar with the name or the work of Moltmann. His best known book is called The Crucified God. And in it he describes how he came to study theology after his experiences of being a prisoner of war. And he graphically describes the situation of the German survivors in the late 1948s, returning to camps and hospitals. And he said, a theology which did not speak of God in the sight of the one who has been abandoned and crucified would have had nothing to say to us. So Moltmann's image, Moltmann developed the idea of a crucified God who died outside the gate on Golgotha for those who are outside. And this image of the outsider has a very special resonance for people living with HIV who may be treated by their church or their community as outsiders. And for me, and for many of my colleagues working closely with some of the world's poorest people, the most appropriate and probably the most inspiring gospel parallel lies not in the healing miracles of Jesus, since in this world we have no healing to offer in this situation, but in the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, where, as you know, the Son of Man says to the righteous, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was sick, you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. A new situation, such as HIV/AIDS, demanded an evolving theology, something that took account of the new reality. And I want to spend the rest of my time now exploring what this theology might look like in a world where the climate is changing and where, in particular, again, it is the poor who are most affected. There's one very basic question that, so far, I haven't asked, and that's this. If we agree, you may not agree, if we agree that there needs to be a new theology, where is that theology to come from? And after I published a theological paper on HIV/AIDS, one criticism, a very fair criticism, that I received was that I had looked only to theologians in the rich north, to Barth, to Moltmann. I hadn't consulted, I was told, feminist theologians or black theologians who came from the worst affected parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And that was true. It was in fact a criticism that was easy to counter because there has been, at least up to a couple of years ago, no theology to speak of coming from those sources with respect to HIV/AIDS, in the sense that, okay, there was a fair amount of Bible study material available which tried to draw biblical parallels with HIV, some parallels good, some less good, but no genuine attempt at original theological thinking. Indeed, my whole study, I wouldn't have undertaken this at all if we hadn't had requests from African church leaders to help them think through the issue theologically before they addressed it within their churches. But nonetheless, the point about which theology are we going to use is one we should never lose sight of. At a Christian conference on climate change last December, I was rather shocked to hear one speaker say that we in the UK, or possibly we in Europe, should decide the theology and then tell people in the developing world that this is what they had to take on board. You can't do that. And unlike the situation with HIV, there is a fair amount of theological thinking going on around the environment, particularly in parts of Asia and in Latin America. And it's important, I think, that this thinking shouldn't be marginalised, but should be brought into mainstream consideration if our aim is a theology that is acceptable to all Christians and not just to those in the West. I'll come back to this briefly in a minute. But first I'd like to look at the way in which Christians have traditionally viewed the world around them. And these factors have already been mentioned several times over the weekend. And then I'd like to suggest that this in itself, the traditional views of the environment, are not enough if we're to take account of climate change and in particular its impact on the world's poorest people. And I think my main problem with tradition is that all too often the Christian view of creation, of nature, of the environment comes across as something of an add-on to the essentials of Christian theology. Let's take just two examples, two models. First of all, we've heard it several times this weekend, a very ancient part of Christian tradition is that nature reveals something of God to humanity. And this is seen most vividly in the wonder expressed by the psalmist. The heavens are telling the glory of God. And then in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we're drawn not to worship nature itself, but to worship the Creator as he's reflected in his creation. And this tradition focuses particularly on the beauty of God, and the role of human beings in this context seems to be simply to worship, to adore God as revealed through nature. In this view, there is, or at least there has been, little or no suggestion of any kind of intimate relationship between us and our environment and nature. Last year, the Church of England produced a document called Sharing God's Planet, a Christian Vision for a Sustainable Future. And this document illustrates this view in that it refers to what it calls the sacrament of creation. And for an official publication from the Church of England, this booklet is unusually poetic. It refers to the exquisite, lively uniqueness of every part of God's creation as an expression of God. It's not at all Anglican, but you get what it means. In short, creation is sacred, or as they put it, everything is unique and everything is a vehicle of God's self-expression. So nature reveals something of God, and that is one clear view. And then secondly, as Bob was illustrating this morning, there's the idea of stewardship, which I think is the word that the majority of Christians would come up with when they're asked about the relationship between human beings and nature. What I find hard is that stewardship is not made fully explicit in the Bible. There is, of course, a statement in Genesis 1 that the newly created human species should have dominion over every living thing. And there's the further detail, as we've heard already in Genesis 2, that God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to keep it. And it's these verses that seem to have become the basis for the idea of a certain human responsibility to the earth, although there's not too much detail as to what form that responsibility should take. Although Deuteronomy, for example, sets out many good agricultural practices that are perhaps meant to help us. So traditionally, theological statements about creation have tended to focus on a certain human duty that arises out of respect for God's creation and out of the response of worship that creation evokes. And in this view, conservation has been mainly seen as a Christian duty, and one, I would argue, that is based on a fairly slight biblical foundation. And above all, creation or nature has been viewed as something fairly separate from human beings. There's little suggestion in these traditional views of any close interaction or interconnectedness with the world of nature. Now, I don't personally believe that it's right to see nature as either just the object of human duty, with all the tediousness and possibly guilt that implies, or simply as a vehicle for God's glory to be displayed, although I don't doubt for a moment that that is the case. And in fact, there's always been more to it than this in Scripture. If we're willing to look, and this point has already been made today, if we're willing to look, there are many examples of God working through nature and with nature to communicate with human beings. Think of the rainbow after the flood, God speaking to Moses out of the burning bush, or the darkness that fell on the earth at the time of the crucifixion. Also, we have in nature an example of forgiveness and of renewal. Nature has the power to heal itself. Just as bushes and trees can regrow damaged limbs, so the ozone layer, we're told, has the capacity to repair itself. There's forgiveness in nature, and I would suggest that we need to be ready to forgive as well. Not to indulge ourselves in a culture of blame, but to forgive the damage that we've already done to the environment, and to seek forgiveness from our fellow human beings for the harm we continue to do them. So I think there's a much closer relationship between God and human beings and the created order than we tend to acknowledge. And for Christians to really take climate change seriously, we need to bring out this relationship of interconnectedness and to set it at the heart of our faith. In other words, we need to reformulate our theology in such a way that both concern for the environment and concern for the poor are integral to it. And it is, of course, the theological truth, as well as the social one, that the true nature of society is revealed not by the lifestyle of the rich, but by the way in which it treats the poor. Now, in the course of Old Testament history, the relationship between God and human beings finds its chief expression in formal covenants, mutual agreements that bind the parties to one another. And as we well know, these covenants are superseded in the New Testament by God's promised new covenant, that is, the coming of Jesus Christ, and through him, a new relationship between God and humankind. Because through his Son, God now moves beyond formal agreements and identifies himself fully with the human condition. This is seen most tellingly in the Gospel accounts of Jesus' baptism, where the sinless Son of God seeks out and accepts the baptism of sinners, indicating his complete identification with the human condition. And what's more, it seems that this new relationship between God in Christ and human beings also includes the created world. So St. John writes, he was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world didn't know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. In his incarnation, Jesus identifies himself not only with us, humans, but with all creation. And this is echoed in Romans 8, those verses that are often quoted to illustrate God's care for the natural world, but which I think also suggest that human beings and nature are in the same situation together as they wait for redemption. St. Paul writes, we know that the whole creation has been groaning in labour pains until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. We're all in it together, basically. So instead of a view of nature which is somehow detached from humankind, or at least that sits at the bottom of a hierarchy which goes God, people, nature, I'd like to suggest that we have instead a triangular relationship, one that fully reflects the interconnectedness of human beings and nature with each other and also with God. And interconnectedness and its close cousin interdependence have become something of buzzwords in Christian ecology. The Church of England report I mentioned earlier quotes Hildegard of Bingen, Evelyn Underhill and St Paul's Epistle to the Colossians, all in support of its argument for interdependence. But because that report's focus is primarily on God and the environment, I think it failed to give sufficient emphasis to the interdependence of all human beings within creation, and that's the relationship I really want to promote to you. From my perspective, this is absolutely vital if we're to take seriously the effect of environmental degradation on the world's poorest peoples. But if we accept that Jesus, in his incarnation, both accepted the human condition and also identified himself with the sufferings of the created world, then this is good news for the poor on two counts. Firstly, because Jesus' ministry reveals his own bias to the poor, and so Christians are compelled to do the same. And secondly, because the interconnectedness of human beings and nature means that the damaged creation, along with the most vulnerable of human beings, the poorest people, necessarily become the main focus of human action in combating climate change. I want in a moment just to outline what climate change at the moment means for the poor and how we might combat it. But let me return briefly to this issue of where does our theology come from. Because there are two main trends that I'm aware of that in some respects differ significantly from our Western Christian view of the environment. The first is the movement known as ecofeminism, and this is particularly under discussion in the countries of Southeast Asia, as well as among some Western feminists. Ecofeminism is a movement that sees itself as an alternative to capitalist and socialist development, a movement where environmental concerns, feminine concerns, and spiritual concerns coincide. One Malaysian theologian, and I'm afraid I can't pronounce her name because it's all consonants, has put it like this: ecofeminism recognises the value of the feminine principle, that is, caring, nurturing and sustaining, thus making women the natural saviours of the environment. Women are seen as being closer to nature than men, and hence are better in analysing and finding solutions to the environmental crisis. Now, in a UK context, this may seem to you a bit over-romantic, but I think it's important to bear in mind that in the developing world, women are the poorest of the poor, and that if we are to restore the dignity of women and to empower women, such insights about the role of women with respect to the big issues like the environment, they must not be overlooked. And the second trend is that offered by liberation theology, particularly as it's manifested in countries like Brazil. Now, my only direct experience of this until recently has been in northeast Brazil, in the area of the Amazon basin. And there, the Christian church is working with local ethnic communities, in particular the Amazonian Indians. So their theology, like all liberation theology, is based on the perceptions of the people, the people's perceptions, the people's understanding of biblical texts and so on. But in Brazil, it takes account not only of that view of the Bible, but also of people's environment and their native culture. And the result is an intricate but highly interconnected view of the world, an interconnectedness that arguably takes account of a much greater range of factors, particularly culture and non-Christian religions, than the corresponding Western theological view tends to do. Let's come back to the sort of theology that I believe Christians, and in fact all people of faith, need to respond to. I said at the beginning that at Christian Aid we believe that our work is underpinned by gospel values. Ours is a response to poverty that's rooted in theology, but it is a response. In other words, theology as an intellectual discipline is just not enough. Theology has to be translated into reality, translated into action. And as John said yesterday, religious belief has greater implications for us than scientific belief. It has lifestyle implications. We have to respond to the situation that science has described for us, and nowhere is the need for positive response more necessary or more universal, I'd suggest, than in the area of climate change. So how are people of faith to respond in the light of this reformulated theology? I suggest that that theology leads us to a threefold response. A response that's based on integrity, a response that has a genuine motivation, and a response that has the real needs of the poor at its heart. So first of all, a response of integrity. Over the past few years, all the major development agencies have invested a lot of time and effort in campaigning nationally and internationally on such global issues as international debt relief and trade justice. And at Christian Aid, we've encouraged our supporters to find imaginative ways of making politicians and opinion formers aware of their views, like the Make Poverty History campaign last year. And I find it intriguing that climate change demands a much deeper, much more personal response than either the international debt campaign or the trade justice campaign. Because along with the national and international pressure that a successful climate change campaign will demand, we cannot, as people of integrity, ask for a response from governments that we're not prepared to give ourselves. I'm told that evangelical Christians in the United States are asking the question, would Jesus drive an SUV? No, don't like that. I'm not for a moment suggesting that we adopt that as a slogan here. But you get the point, all the time we're not prepared to give up our gas guzzlers, whether they're SUVs or something else, or give up other environmentally destructive luxuries. We're in no position to ask the same or more of others. So, a response of integrity. And then secondly, I believe our response to the theology I've outlined needs to be genuinely motivated. It is, as I've just said, vital that we get our own houses and lifestyles in order, at the same time as putting pressure on governments. But I do think when we do that, when we put pressure on governments, when we get our lifestyles in order, we should do it out of the right motives. And again, I'm slightly shocked. I'm not easily shocked, but I was slightly shocked at the smugness I've encountered among some environmentalists. There seems to be a sort of feel-good factor that's a consequence of recycling, of reducing the use of cars and air travel and so on. Installing solar panels, using low-energy light bulbs or green electricity should not be seen primarily, certainly not by people of faith, as cost-saving devices. That's not the reason for preferring them, and we should not be silent on the underlying theological reasons that we have for making these environmentally sound choices. In the same way, I think we should not limit our efforts to our own homes, our offices, our churches, whatever, and feel we've done our bit. We won't have achieved anything until it becomes clear that environmental damage has been halted and, wherever possible, reversed. Until then, we have no reason whatsoever to feel good. But having said that, there's not too much place for a guilt trip either. If we truly believe that there's an interconnectedness between us and nature and God, then we simply have to get on with the job of making that relationship better, to do what we can to make that relationship work. And that's why our future work at Christian Aid is going to take a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, addressing personal lifestyle, and this includes the offices in which we work. We're going to turn the heating down by 2 degrees, which won't go down well. And by also taking campaigning action at national and international levels. The two have to go together. And then thirdly, a response to the kind of theology I've outlined needs to have the needs of the poor at heart. We need to take into account our relationship with our fellow human beings. Dennis spoke yesterday of God creating a tough world which facilitates moral and spiritual growth. And 8 years in development have shown me just how tough that world can be for very many people. And yet the message of the New Testament is clear. In Matthew 25, the Son of Man says to the righteous and to the unrighteous, "Just as you did it to one of the least of those who are members of my family, you did it to me." So what policies can we adopt that will work in favour of the world's poor and not against them? Well, anyone who's been in downtown Nairobi in the rush hour, who has travelled across the Indian city of Hyderabad in an open taxi or on foot, will be all too familiar with the pollution that takes its toll on human health as well as on the environment. But is the answer to turn around to these countries, to Kenya and to India, and say, "Sorry, you've got to give up your motor vehicles. We're going to do that, why can't you?" And no, frankly, this is not the option. Zero economic growth, I believe, is not an option for the world's poorest countries, although it may well be for the richer economies. Even in the most remote parts of developing countries, poor people are uncomfortably aware of all that the rich world has and that they do not have. And keeping people in poverty on the pretext of saving the environment simply must not be allowed to happen. There are alternatives, and we need to pursue those alternatives urgently, not on our behalf, but on behalf of the developing world. People who drive old cars on leaded fuel or on sulphur, unspeakably horrible, do that because it's all they can afford. They have no choice, because choice is the luxury of the rich. People need to be supported in developing environmentally acceptable alternatives and not have what they've achieved this far being taken away from them. So organisations like mine, I think, should be subsidising non-polluting vehicles, non-polluting industries, helping people to progress by leapfrogging certain technological developments. Go to Tanzania and East Africa, go anywhere in Central America, and you'll see countless people with mobile phones, but no landlines that work, because the intermediate stage of telecommunications development has simply been missed out. And that seems to be a principle that we can extend to many other areas. We may see ourselves as giving up some of our destructive excesses, but we shouldn't forget that people in the developing world have little or nothing to give up, yet their development has to be encouraged in the most environmentally sustainable way possible. I want to end, and this is a bit lighter, by focusing a little more attention on how climate change is currently affecting the world's poorest people. Necessarily, perhaps inevitably, a lot of evidence that reaches us is anecdotal. But what is alarming is the increasing number of such anecdotes that are reaching us from different parts of the developing world. So let me tell you the story about a farmer in Nicaragua who is called Juan Francisco. Juan Francisco is a 38-year-old farmer. He has a wife and 6 children, aged between 3 and 15. And Juan Francisco worries about drought. And in his own words, he says, "I think the climate has gone crazy." The problem is the delayed rainy season. The rains are now coming in Nicaragua in mid-June instead of at the start of May. Now, the problem for Juan Francisco is that he grows both maize, which has 1 harvest a year, and beans, which should have 2 harvests a year, and he depends on those harvests to feed his family and to earn a living by selling the excess. But if he plants his maize and it doesn't rain until June, he's not going to be able to plant his second crop of beans in August, as he normally would, because he can't take up the maize to make room for it. So he loses his second harvest. And if he loses his second harvest, he has no income. And he knows that in that situation, he will have to leave home. He will have to go to Costa Rica as an illegal immigrant for 6 months to work illegally on coffee plantations. And sadly, there's a fair chance that he might be caught and put in prison because of it. While the delay in the arrival of the rainy season in Nicaragua will have next to no impact on the lives of the rich people in the country's capital, even this relatively minor form of climate change is devastating the lives of poorer people like Juan Francisco and others in Nicaragua and beyond. And then, of course, as Bob reminded us this morning, the problem of the hurricanes. Central America has been severely hit by hurricanes that have increased in frequency and intensity over the last few years. In particular, you may remember Hurricane Mitch back in 1998 and Hurricane Stan just last year, both of which had a terrible impact on poor people's lives, destroying homes that they can't afford to rebuild, killing animals that they can't afford to replace. So last week, when I was in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, I think that's where I was in a village. I was in a village where people earn at most $3 a day, and more commonly it's about $1 a day. El Salvador switched a year or two back to the American currency with the result of chronic inflation, actually, but that's another story. They told me how Hurricane Stan swept away nearly all their cows and their small calves, and the calves were to some extent their investment for the future. And they can't afford to replace them because young heifers cost $300, dairy cows cost $700. You can't buy a $700 cow on $3 a day. It just doesn't work. People there also told me that for the next hurricane season that's due to start next month, 25 tropical storms are forecast, of which 2 are predicted to be extremely severe. Now, our partner organisations in the area can help people build houses that will withstand the impact of a hurricane. They can train people to be alert to hurricanes, to the danger. They can train them in what to do to save their lives when disaster strikes. But what they can't do is to guarantee to restore all those lost animals and those lost homes. Last year I was in Bangladesh, and again Bob has already mentioned Bangladesh, where rising sea levels have already started to produce the phenomenon of environmental refugees, poor people who have to move inland to try to start their lives over again. And that's quite a challenge, even if you're well educated and have certain skills. If you're poor and illiterate, the challenge is almost impossible. Or think of the effects of the Asian tsunami. The rich people seem to be coming out of it all right. They have the resources, they have the skills to start up over again, to rebuild. The poor fishermen are struggling to replace their lost boats. And in the state of Tamil Nadu, where I was last year, the Indian government is still arguing over where those fishermen should rebuild their houses, so they have no homes either, as well as no boats. A year ago, the burning question was, where was God in the Asian tsunami? An even more burning question, I would suggest, than the problem that the Lisbon earthquake posed for Austin Tower that John mentioned yesterday. So these are just a few of the effects of climate change in poor communities, and a few of the reasons why it's absolutely imperative that theology must take account of the relatedness between the world's people, as well as between people, creation and God. I should perhaps add that although people in the poor communities that I've been talking about and have visited have generally little scientific conception of why the climate is changing, they're not sitting back and doing nothing. In El Salvador, as in many countries in Central America and in Sub-Saharan Africa, deforestation is aggravating the effects of climate change, and people on the ground know they have to reverse this. In the area I was in last week, poor people have for years been using the wood from mangrove trees for fuel, because that's the only source of wood that they have. And the result is that the mangrove swamps, with their important stocks of crabs that people trade and use to earn a living, the swamps become polluted and flooded. And so even in these poor communities, they're systematically replanting mangrove trees. And I was quite humbled when somebody said to me, It's our fault, you know. Changes all spring from deforestation. We've got to change. And I said, well, no, actually, it's the fault of countries like mine. No, they're terribly polite and said, well, no, he protested, it's our fault too. And I think we do have lessons that we can learn from the world's poorest people, not least from those who are more closely in touch with the environment than most of us are, as well as lessons we can learn from people whom society treats as outsiders. You may remember the Old Testament story in 2 Kings chapter 7 of the 4 lepers who took the risk of entering the Aramean camp in search of food. If the lepers hadn't undertaken this risky activity and brought back the message of what they found there, the whole population of Samaria, beset by famine, would have died. But whoever we are and wherever we live, I believe that we all need to hear what science is telling us, and we all need to be prepared to act upon it. And theologians, I would suggest, have a duty and a calling to work alongside the scientists to ensure that we do just that. Thank you.
So, who would like to ask the first question on this very practical topic? Yes.
Should we be thinking about more alternative technology ways of tackling these problems rather than perhaps some of the ways that you're thinking about?
Okay, the question is, should we be thinking more of alternative theology?
Technology.
Technology, sorry.
Technology applied to tackle
Instead of
the usual Western ways perhaps modification. Large hydraulic schemes along with hydropower.
alternative technology is not strictly my area or my competence, but I think our view is yes, we should, certainly, but in combination with other initiatives, clearly. But green electricity is an obvious example.
I wonder if a good word is appropriate technologies in the sense of what's appropriate for that particular context, actually, and what will actually fit into that particular environment, what's suitable for that. And multinational companies don't always have that attitude. It's one size fits all, and we're going to export it now. So, yes, Hillary, yes.
Yes, in one of your responses was about being genuinely motivated rather than just seeing it as a cost-saving exercise. And I totally agree with that on a sort of personal, individual level. But is it not true that when it comes to things like persuading industry to change and bigger multinationals and so on, you actually really need to make a case for economic benefits as well? But that's really, in a sort of capitalist world we live in, and that's going to be the driver for change at that sort of level.
I think that's right. Sorry, should we not also be motivated by economic considerations when addressing industry as well as apart from our own personal response? And I hope what I was trying to say was, again, it was coming from the perspective of a Christian perspective or a faith perspective, that we ourselves need to get it together before we can put demands on anyone else. Now, how those demands are formulated, which may well be in economic terms for multinationals or in other terms for governments, is, again, it's a question of appropriateness, isn't it?
Well,
you said in the middle that nature contains forgiveness and renewal. I can understand the renewal part of nature, but I wondered if you could amplify how nature contains the possibility of forgiveness, because I've always thought of forgiveness as a uniquely human or God-given activity between God and humans, or human and human. How can, that's it. How can nature contain forgiveness? Didn't understand what you meant.
Well, I guess within the renewal, there's the element of conveying that it's made right, that although we're conscious of what we've done wrong, there is this forgiving aspect to nature, and that it renews itself. I mean, I do see that as a forgiving attitude and not just a mechanistic renewal factor.
Doesn't forgiveness have to have something wrong done against you in order to have the possibility of forgiveness?
Well, we are wronging the ozone layer, if you like, by destroying it. Sorry?
It's us so wrong.
We are doing wrong to nature, to the environment, to the extent to which it is renewable or self-renewing.
It's maybe forgiving, like the possibility of renewing the ozone.
It's not a profound theological point.
I was just trying to understand what you...
We chopped down a forest that we shouldn't have done for our own profit, but the forest could regenerate, and when you see it regenerating, you feel the sense of forgiveness by nature.
I think if
Is that romantic?
Well, I think if you sort of accept this version of an interconnected view of mankind, humankind, nature and God, then it's legitimate to talk about these more anthropomorphic concepts like forgiveness.
When I catch a mouse in a mouse trap, as I do regularly, I always apologise to it. It doesn't do much good.
This is on tape, so there's question on the back.
Yes, can I just follow on from that? You said just a few moments ago, if one takes this interconnected view of God and man and nature. Now, at the outset of your talk, you were talking about the diversities of different theologies, and you mentioned more recent ones, black theology, feminist theology, ecofeminism, etc., etc., and which one would be the most helpful. I'm a little unsure whether you're saying we pick the theology that does what we want to do, or whether you're saying theology is the way that things are, and therefore we have to fit in with it. Now, when you say, if you take this viewpoint of a sort of triangular formation of God, man and nature, is that an option we can pick or reject as we wish, or is it an obligation on us to accept it?
Okay, the question has to do with how we choose theology. Yeah? Do we pick the one that best suits our purposes, essentially, or not? I think we select the one that, again, is this word, is most appropriate in the context. But in this sort of context of global damage, I think it's a theology that needs to take into account the theological insights, not just of us here, as I've suggested, but takes into account the insights of people worldwide. And that, in my thinking, because I'm Western and conditioned, may not be actually the theology that I particularly want to use. But I think this is how theology evolves. These are considerations we have to take into account in this particular context.
You said a point there. I think it's quite interesting to pick up what Bob White was citing from the 16th century commentary by Calvin on the book of Genesis. Now, I don't think Calvin had a great environmental view of the planet at that time, as far as we know. You know, he just didn't have access to all this kind of information. And yet, just simply looking at the passage, actually, unwrapping what it said, he came up with actually a very wonderful, environmentally friendly statement of the need to care for the next generation and so on, simply sort of taking the passage. I found that quite interesting, you know, that was simply in isolation, as it were, from the contemporary environmental debate completely. So, next question. Yes.
I can give one example of the use of new technology to deal with the situation. It doesn't sound right, but one of my grandsons has developed a scheme by which you can produce a house within 12 hours to deal with flood situations or disaster. And in New York, he's just got the such a prize of $100,000. John Prescott was given £70,000 to develop, and his grandson has been to New York, been to Geneva, see NGOs, and 3 of them are very keen on this idea. I'm just mentioning that as an example of the new technology.
Yeah.
It's all due to, he got the idea from an eggshell. and that all one does is use cement impregnated canvas. It can all be put into a sack, and one pours water on this, and the walls spring up, and they should last at least 10 years.
This is a comment about developing houses that can be erected within 12 hours, is it?
Yes.
And are substantial protection, presumably, against floods and hurricanes and all the rest. Yeah, I mean, if I could just add a point I might have made. We in the development agencies obviously love to encourage initiatives of this sort, and we can do quite a lot in helping people to live with the effects of climate change, of which this would seem to be an example. But there is a limit to what we can do. For example, in Senegal, one of our partners has developed a more economic form of cooking using a wood burning stove that only burns for 1 hour instead of 8 or something, and then saves, all the wood that would otherwise have been cut down in order to feed that. And it also produces a stove which doesn't emit these poisonous fumes that can be lethal within an African hut. Now, we can do that, it's very cost effective, but it is only helping people to live with climate change, possibly advancing their standard of living a tiny, tiny bit, but not very much. So to be truly effective, we must obviously pursue such initiatives, but they must go hand in glove with really effective advocacy campaigning at an international level.
Yes.
I come from a sub-Saharan African country, and I sometimes wonder some of the comments that my government has made in terms of the treatment of HIV and AIDS. And I was just wondering, how does your organisation work with governments to negotiate its theology in working in HIV and AIDS treatment programs?
Okay, the question is about the relationship between theology and HIV treatment prevention campaigns in sub-Saharan Africa. We tend not to work directly with governments, we work through churches. And it's obviously in helping churches to develop a theology that takes account, that endeavours to remove stigmatisation from people who are living with HIV, that promotes compassion and all the usual things to do with HIV. That enables them, and again we can help them further, to be effective advocates with their government, which is how we would prefer to work through the people themselves. Now, you'll know that in some countries, South Africa, but Uganda is typically cited, the churches and the government have worked extraordinarily well together. They got in very early and developed their thinking relatively early, with the effect that for the moment, the spread of HIV in Uganda appears to have stabilised. Some people say it's falling. I would suggest that because of the war in the north, that's a bit over-optimistic. But it is crucial in working in sub-Saharan Africa and some other developing countries to empower the churches, because it's church leaders that people listen to, or the imams, or the faith leaders. They are so important in many developing countries, much more so than here, where we're used to ignoring the Archbishop's latest pronouncement. That if you can get the right message to those faith leaders, and I hope this will happen on the environment as well, then the message will get out and it will be listened to. When I was in Bangladesh last year, somebody says to me, well, when the Imam speaks, we all listen. It's the word of God. We take on board what he says. And these are the important people from our point of view. And to reach them, we do need to do it through theology, through their worldview.
Yes.
There are a number of Christian radio stations which regularly broadcast materials relating to, say, AIDS and HIV and general hygiene and so on, often with very interesting results. Do you collaborate with them?
The question is, do we collaborate with Christian radio stations who promote HIV prevention and similar programs? The way Christian Aid works, and Tear Fund and other agencies do the same, is not to do the work ourselves. We work with partner organisations on the ground, because they know the situation so much better than we do sitting in London. And I think it is certainly the case that some of our partner organisations would be engaged in that kind of work, but it's not something we do directly.
It has huge potential.
Indeed, yeah, and the power of radio, again in countries where there's perhaps one radio between a certain number of houses, or I was in a village in Mali in West Africa a few years ago, there was one television that sat in the middle of the village, and people really listened, you know, to that one form of communication. It's tremendously important. And oral communication, above all, not written communication.
Yes.
Basically, I have two questions. You mentioned you have experience working with some environmentalists, but I still doubt if we can share the same philosophical or even theological reasons. Because, for example, like the extreme case like New Age movement, they also advocate to protect the forest, but because they believe they are spirits. So is that matter when we try to cooperate with some other partners, but with different position or theological reflection? And the second question...
Could I take that one first? The question has to do with who can we legitimately cooperate with, I guess, in this work in environmental preservation. What I would say to that is that, without giving you a straight answer on the organisation you mentioned, the more, particularly people of faith, work together, the more effective their voice is going to be. And this has been shown time and time again in many, many countries, particularly on the HIV issue, but on a whole range of other development issues as well, where people can overcome their religious differences, even if it's only on this one issue. Governments will listen much more readily to the combined voices of Christians and Muslims in Uganda than they will to either group on their own. And I think with the environment, this is true of the secular organisations as well. And you may be aware of the Stop Climate Chaos campaign, isn't it, which covers 18 organisations, so a lot of organisations, some faith-based, many not. Now, to collaborate with them doesn't necessarily mean that you're accepting their worldview, but on this issue, you know, these very different organisations are saying we are united, and that makes their voice, I believe, so much more effective than organisations on their own.
The technical word is co-belligerence. It's a technical word for that particular thing. Sorry.
Okay. My second question is maybe not too relevant, and that is, have you done some theological reflection on business area? As I know, Christian Aid is supporting like fair trade arrangement.
The question is, have we done some theological thinking on the areas of business, fair trade and so on? We have done a bit on trade justice. I have to say this was a biblically based approach that we were asked to develop for the Church of England Synod. And in fact it's a theological position that's easy to argue, because if you look in the Bible, trade appears a great deal, and the example of bad, wicked traders also appear a great deal. So the arguments for fairly trading are there in Scripture. So too, of course, the Bible is absolutely full of social justice comments, much more than anything on the environment. So again, the longing for justice, I think, permeates the whole of the Bible. And so biblical theology very readily takes account of the challenges posed by modern business situations.
Right at the back, yes.
Yes, linking once again to the argument of stewardship, do Christian organisations monitor their own environmental performance, either through a strict methodology or more sort of casual ways?
They're starting to, and we are certainly starting to, because we recognise we cannot do anything until we've addressed the problem ourselves. So Christian Aid is a huge organisation. I work in the central London office where there are 400 or 500 of us all in the same building. And you can imagine the environmental challenges that poses. But for some time now, one of our business managers has been monitoring the amount of air travel we do and setting aside, and it's a huge amount. I mean, I spend a lot of time in the air, and so do my colleagues. For each air journey that we take, we set aside a certain amount of money that's going to be ploughed back into environmental work. So there are many options for businesses and so on to do this. And certainly I think no Christian organisation, or indeed any faith-based organisation, can legitimately look the world in the face and tell them to do something about global warming if it hasn't started with itself.
Yes, yes. Yeah, on a personal level, what are the sort of most important 3 or 4 things that individuals can do in terms of changing their own lifestyles to, you know, sort of offset climate change?
I think get to know your carbon footprint and do something about it, basically. I'm told, I haven't done this, that there are ways, that the web has a number of free ways of telling you how you can calculate that and then set about reducing your own personal carbon emissions ratio, and that will make a huge difference. For us, we're about to say no internal flights, which is going to be miserable because I go up to Scotland quite a bit, and it's going to mean nights on the sleeper train. So it's not going to be easy to do this sort of thing. And solar panels and all this sort of thing are clearly significant contributions. I think it's very tempting to say, well, I can't do very much, so I won't bother doing anything at all. The typical sort of resignation that you mentioned earlier. That's not true. We know perfectly well that if enough people do take an action, then it becomes very much more effective than the sum of the component parts almost.
And for people in Cambridge, getting on our bikes, I think. Yeah, so, right, there's several questions, several hands going up. I think, was that a hand or just waving your pen? No, there's waving pen. So hand at the back. So yes, Ruth.
I just think GNER is great, so you enjoy train journeys up Scotland. Yeah, I was just, I mean, I move in specifically Christian circles in my work, and I still meet lots of people who doubt that climate change is actually happening. I mean, is this something that you're still aware that is still in a way a battle that needs to be fought, of continually educating? I mean, I still met someone last week who got confused between the ozone layer, the greenhouse effect, and sort of spouted spurious statistics and things, and was quite doubtful in the whole process. You know.
The question is, how do we deal with people who say, is climate change really happening? And I have to say, with respect, the scientists haven't done us a great favour in this, presenting conflicting views, where really we have to be in a position to take one view or the other. I think there is denial, undoubtedly. Whenever people are faced with a huge problem, they turn to solutions that say, it doesn't actually exist, so don't worry. And again, this was true of HIV, still is in some countries, and we can see it, as you say, in climate change. I guess you need to look at why people are in denial, whether it's because they're overwhelmed with the size of the problem, the feeling they can't do anything, or even their government can't do anything that would affect anybody anyway, or whether it's a politically motivated or big business motivated form of denial, which is something else. We had to come to a decision on it. You know, if you're a major organisation going into a big campaign, there comes a point where you've got to draw a line under all the conflicting views and say, okay, we believe it's happening, and this is what we're going with.
Yes.
Excuse me. If you have visited Bangladesh or that part of the world, you may have noticed that how the multinational companies started promotion about the soft drinks. I mean, even now, the India-England one-day international match is going on. Every 10 seconds, you will be seeing the advertisement of Pepsi or Coca-Cola, and the slogan is, "Be young, have fun, drink Pepsi." The problem is that in the village or the suburban areas where the Coca-Cola or the Pepsi bottling plant is there, and people are getting jobs, So when the environmental groups, either secular or the faith-based groups, when they're saying people that these are the problems, people are saying that, look, I mean, we need to have jobs. So we don't care much about the environment or, about whatever. Now our governments, to be honest, are uncritically accepting the model of civilization, which is big shopping mall and flyover and all these things, etc. And sometimes even for good conscious people, that's ethical dilemma. For example, I got to know about this course through internet, but I know the computers are being dumped into Bay of Bengal, and our governments don't have any recycling policy about the computer parts and things like that. And so in that part of the world, what would be the judicious balance between economic development and then caring for the environment and in the most sensible way? I don't have the answer because I'm asking for you.
The question has to do with the balance between economic development in countries like Bangladesh and India and care for the environment. I wish I had all the answers, I really do. One thing we know about our work in Bangladesh is that the people are extraordinarily good at campaigning, at lobbying their government. And this to us is an ideal way forward because they know they have to protect the jobs in Coca-Cola or Pepsi or whoever it is who set up there. But they also might want to challenge the environmental practices. Now, the voice of the people is far more effective than an outside voice within that local situation. I come back to the point I made that we mustn't allow environmental concerns to not benefit, to be to the detriment of
and
the
just another point, in that part of Bangladesh, that there is a kind of endemic arsenic poisoning.
Yes.
So what happened that the water analysis was done, and the report showed that there is toxic levels of arsenic and lead and all the toxic chemicals, and the multinational companies kind of bribed the government officials, and the report was kind of kept under the carpet, and then poor farmers, they are paying huge amount of the money for just drinking the toxic materials, and we kind of gave in. Now you will be finding Pepsi, Coca-Cola, or whatever in the poor villages even, and the way having be young, have fun, drink Pepsi. That's kind of the slogan they promoted, and the lifestyle. Now we are getting junk foods and all those kind of things which will be creating problems, and we are getting modern, Western, civilized, and a huge propaganda where, with a secular message, this is my life, it's only life, I don't care about the future generations anyway. And I think there is much scope for the faith-based organizations to have the dialogue and work together. And for example, in HIV campaign in India is a miserable failure. Just distributing condoms is not going to work. Rather, ABC, abstinence Bible C, I will be rather going for ABC rather than just any condom. But we are not doing much. We are just kind of giving in to, with all due respect, secular message of not taking enough responsibility, and this is my life, I will be doing whatever I would like to do, and it's getting terrible impact in the life of the poor, and as you have correctly pointed out, in the lives of the poor people. And we are just seeing UN or WHO, in my opinion, miserable failure. India, the show, the HIV or things, it's not going to work, but we are not telling the message in the clearest possible way that they need to hear.
Again, the question is about the impact of modernisation on India, Bangladesh. Now, I wouldn't want to demonise Coca-Cola, but again, my experience of working in India is that the people are extraordinarily hot on human rights, and it is really for everyone to work together with them to enable them again to lobby the government to make this point very clear. I totally agree with you about the situation on HIV in India, and in my view this is down to the fact there's so much widespread denial, Oh, it's not a problem here, they tell me. Only 1% of the population is
Oh, yes,
affected.
it is there.
Yes, I know. 1% of the population of India is a huge, huge number of people affected by HIV. And somehow, faith-based organisations, perhaps working together, though I think that's actually quite difficult in the Indian context, working together to lobby government with the help of NGOs. You know, this is the place, I believe, where the action needs to happen, but always to bear in mind the needs of the poorest people rather than the factory owners or the people in government who seem to be benefiting from this.
Good. Well, I can feel both tea and football sort of approaching something. I don't know. We have worked very hard, and I know you've had a very hard weekend, tough weekend. This is a tough one. So, first of all, I think we'd like to thank Paula again very much.